It's Encounter on the Voice of America. Encounter on the Voice of America brings together advocates and opponents debating the critical issues of our time in a freewheeling, no-holds-barred discussion of fact and opinion. With today's guests and the topic for Encounter, here is Carol Castiel.
Welcome to Encounter on the Voice of America. On this edition of the program, the United States renews its focus on the Asia-Pacific region. As the Obama administration accelerates U.S. troop withdrawals from Iraq and Afghanistan, it is turning its attention to this dynamic region. In doing so, the United States is also serving notice that it will serve as a counterweight to China's growing economic, military, and diplomatic influence. Hello again, I'm Carol Castiel. U.S. President Barack Obama recently returned from a 9-day trip aimed at reestablishing U.S. leadership in the Pacific region. He hosted the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in his native state of Hawaii and attended the ASEAN conference in Bali, Indonesia. On the way, he made an important stopover in Australia. In his address to the Australian Parliament, President Obama affirmed what he called a fundamental truth, which is that the United States has been and always will be a Pacific nation.
As President, I have therefore made a deliberate and strategic decision. As a Pacific nation, the United States will play a larger and long-term role in shaping this region and its future by upholding core principles and in close partnership with our allies and friends.
As part of this pivot toward the Pacific, President Obama announced plans to establish a permanent U.S. military presence in Australia. Under the new agreement, an initial group of 250 U.S. Marines will deploy and rotate in and out of bases in northern Australia, eventually expanding to a 2,500-strong Marine Air-Ground Task Force. Upgrading the 60-year Australian-American alliance is seen in the region as a clear message from Washington to Beijing amid concerns about possible conflict over the South China Sea. Well, for more on the significance of this U.S. pivot toward the Pacific and China's reaction, we turn to two distinguished regional experts. Walter Lohman is the director of the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. Well, that's a think tank based here in Washington. And Patrick Cronin. He's a senior advisor and senior director of the Asia-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. That's a policy group also based in Washington. And both gentlemen join me here at the VOA Broadcast Center in Washington. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Well, Walter Lohman, I'd like to begin with you to get your reaction to the trip that President Obama made to the region, this pivot toward the Pacific. Do you agree with this renewed emphasis, and why now, in your view?
Well, I think the trip was a huge success. The president did indeed demonstrate the Americans' continuing presence and relevance to the region. I think it's a little bit misleading to talk about a renewed focus or America being back and this sort of thing, the rhetoric that the administration's often used, because it exaggerates how much presence we have here compared to previous. I mean, we've never really left the Pacific. We've been there in a vital role for the last 60 years or so, maintaining peace and stability and the safety of the sea lanes. But going back much further than that, to the turn of the 20th century, going back 50, 60 years before that. So we've been in the Pacific a very long time. We're not newcomers there. And I think it's not necessarily helpful to talk about it in those terms as the administration has done occasionally.
Patrick Cronin, your take on the trip. Do you also think perhaps that was misplaced, this sense of this being a renewed focus? How do you see this so-called pivot, particularly as the U.S. is drawing down in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, I think it's accurate to say we're not returning to the Asia-Pacific, but we are deepening the relationship in the Asia-Pacific region. And what President Obama has done in 9 days of diplomacy is he's strengthened our military policy by announcing this relatively modest but still very firm foothold in Australia. He strengthened our economic policy by putting forth a U.S.-led open trading system, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, at the APEC meeting that he hosted in Hawaii. And he led politically at the East Asia Summit by getting 16 of 18 member nations represented at the highest level to agree that a multilateral maritime security approach is better than, say, a China-preferred unilateral approach for dealing with these issues individually with countries. That's not a bad bit of diplomacy, but it doesn't fundamentally shift anything. It just sets the direction that I think both parties in America would like to see U.S. policy heading in the coming decade and beyond.
Back to you, Walter Lohman. Do you think this emphasis on the Pacific in any way is a detriment to other parts of the world that the U.S. is engaged in, particularly the Middle East with the uprisings, some of which are turning violent and troublesome, such as in Egypt and Syria? Do you think this will take away, or can, as they say, the United States walk and chew gum at the same time?
No, I don't think it'll take away from those things. It is a trick to stay engaged globally and still increase your activity in one particular part of the world. If anything, just for the fact that time is limited and the president's time limited more than anyone else's. So, I mean, it's going to be a trick to pull off. That is, attend more of these summits, have more foreign leaders in Washington from Asia Pacific, any number of things, stretching our military budget to increase presence in Australia and elsewhere, and still maintain the kind of focus we need in the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, et cetera. But I think it can be done.
Patrick Cronin, do you think this is the right move at the right time, or is there a risk of diverting attention from other critically important areas such as the Persian Gulf, given Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons and, of course, the democratic uprisings, which are perhaps even recreating the political landscape in the Middle East?
Really, the Indo-Pacific regions of the world, across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, are at the center of economic and political interest for the United States in the 21st century. So I think it is the right direction, but we're a global power. We have very long and abiding interests, obviously, in the Middle East. Iran is a big problem. So we have to act globally. But still, as a matter of emphasis, yes, I think this pivot does head in the right direction, especially after a decade when we had such a singular focus on fighting terrorism that got grounded into two long-term counterinsurgencies in Afghanistan and Iraq. This does help provide a positive step that the United States is going to be renewed, strong, a big leading economy and democracy in an area where the emerging economies are centered.
Back to you, Walter Lohman. How much of this pivot, as we have called it, toward the Pacific is a result of pressure from allies in the region, from Vietnam to the Philippines to other countries? Are they asking the United States to re-engage, particularly because they're wary of China's rise?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's underappreciated, perhaps purposely so, in Beijing. I mean, the Filipinos and the Vietnamese particularly have been advocating an increased American presence in the region. The Philippines are a treaty ally. I mean, we have treaty commitments to defend the Philippines that extend to its armed forces and to its public vessels. So, when we talk about the U.S. commitment there, we're talking about legal obligations we have to the Philippines. With Vietnam, we have an increasing, growing relationship with them, military as well as other facets. And that's good. But I mean, the Chinese interaction with the Filipinos is something that could call the U.S. directly into conflict in the South China Sea.
I want to turn to the South China Sea question in a moment, but back to you, Patrick Cronin. How much do you think this pivot, as I said, toward the Pacific has to do with allies in the region, lobbying the United States to get more involved?
The United States could not be undertaking this bit of diplomacy without the encouragement of more than a dozen countries in this region. And Chinese assertiveness, their growing military modernization in the last few years have been the underpinning of this diplomacy. That is, it has led every country from our partner like Singapore to our ally like the Philippines, allies like Australia and Japan, to encourage further United States staying power, to show and demonstrate that we're not going away. And so what President Obama has tried to say is we're not just a permanent Pacific nation, we actually are a permanent Pacific power. And at a time when we have fiscal debates about whether we can afford enough on defense and we're drawing down from two wars, there are a lot of countries in the region saying we're watching a rising China. Are you really going to stay here, or can we really count on you to work with us and protect us? And I think the clear answer, and it's not just a partisan answer, I think it's a bipartisan answer in the United States, is yes, we're going to be here for a long time.
Back to you, Walter Lohman. Let's take a look at what was accomplished at the APEC summit in Hawaii that President Obama hosted. There was talk of a so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership. Talk about the significance of this partnership. Who's involved? What are the criteria? And what is the purpose of that partnership?
Well, I think that's the principal achievement of the APEC gathering. In fact, that happens on the side of APEC. It's not a part of APEC, at least not currently. It's a trade agreement involving 9 countries, bigger than $22 trillion economy if we include Japanese. And that was the big news in that regard, was that the Japanese decided to join the negotiations to begin to talk to other members about actually participating in the broader trade arrangement. The exciting thing about it is that it could serve as a basis for an APEC-wide trade agreement. That's something that was just tabled a few years ago. And now APEC as a whole pretty much agrees that it should serve as the basis for an APEC-wide agreement. It's a first-class trade agreement we're working on, cover all sectors of the economy's investment areas, with a number of unique provisions on labor and environment and the sort of things that this administration thinks will be part of 21st century trade agreements.
Patrick Cronin, anything to add or subtract to that description of this new partnership, and certainly what are the advantages for the United States, particularly given our unemployment problem, the economic downturn? Does it benefit the United States in that regard?
Well, there's a lot of debate domestically in the United States about whether trade benefits the U.S. because jobs seem to go overseas. I'm a big believer that this trade ultimately helps us and that our economy has to be pegged to these rising economies in Asia-Pacific region. This decade is all about what type of trade regime will prevail in this broad Asia-Pacific region. Trans-Pacific Partnership is now just representing 5% of the economy. It's going to grow, hopefully, over the next several years as members join, and maybe this will become the APEC-driven, inclusive, rules-based trading system that the United States really wants to help promote and lead. But there are competitors. The Chinese might want an alternative system that's not as open, not as rules-based, or at least based on their rules. So that's where this competition is heading. And in the meantime, the 10 members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations of ASEAN are supposed to be heading toward their own free trade arrangement by 2015. They're not likely to achieve that date, but think of it as an economy like the European Union, that they hope to set up this sort of common economy very soon. That's happening within the larger Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Framework that stretches all the way to South America's Pacific coast. So this is a huge bit of the global economy in the 21st century. We're either going to be driving it and part of it, or we're going to be outside.
If I could just add on the point of bipartisanship, specifically with regard to trade, if you look at the agreements just passed, the 3 FTAs that just passed, Panama, Colombia, and South Korea, they passed with very healthy margins. And in the case of the South Korean agreement, they passed with 219 Republican votes. So I think a lot of times, we fret so much over the trade consensus and how hard it is to sell people on trade. Actually, when it comes down to it and people vote, we always vote on the side of free trade. A trade agreement has never lost in either house of Congress, and that consensus is very strong on the Republican side, particularly.
Well, indeed. In fact, it's really the Democrats who are traditionally, skittish about trade agreements, worrying about jobs going overseas. But evidently, like you said, there was a bipartisanship, so Democrats also had to buy in.
Even the staunchest supporters of the Obama Asia policy team of the last 3 years were very worried about why the administration wasn't leading faster on things like the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. And people speculate it's because of unions and political issues with certain constituents. So yeah, I think that is a fair assessment.
You're listening to Encounter on the Voice of America. My guests are Walter Lohman. He's the director of the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation, and that's a think tank based here in Washington. And Patrick Cronin. He's a senior advisor and senior director of the Asia Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. That's a policy group also based in Washington. And we're talking about the United States' focus on the Asia-Pacific region. And this is a reminder that you can listen to Encounter online as a podcast. Well, Walter Lohman, I'd like to turn now to the agreement that President Obama announced in Australia with the permanent military presence. How significant was this announcement, and what's in it for the United States and for the allies in the region?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that this has been underway for some time. The Australians are very deeply engaged in our effort to revamp our global forces and shift them where they need to be the most. I only say that because I think that some folks in the region comfort themselves that it's only an election year thing. Every year the President of the United States gets tough with China during an election year, but it's actually much deeper than that. Sort of evidenced by the fact that we've been working on this for so long with the Australians. I think it's, operationally, it's not near as significant as it is symbolically. I mean, the fact that we're expanding our presence in Australia on a near permanent basis, at least we will have a consistent presence in Australia with Marines. 2012, 250 Marines, leading up to 2,500 by 2016, there for training and joint exercises and the like. I think they will be, sort of conceptually on call for contingencies throughout the Pacific, including South China Sea, if they're called on to do that.
Patrick Cronin, how do you assess the agreement? More symbolism than substance?
I think important on both scores. I think Walter's given a fair assessment. The first signal is to reassure the entire region that the United States is going to be this Pacific power, not just a Pacific nation. But let's not diminish the operational benefit of even 2,500 Marines. And when the Chinese criticize this, 2,500 Marines, and they're not even additional Marines, they're just of our existing Marines, based in the Northern Territory of Australia, are hardly a threat to 1.5 billion Chinese. But operationally, they are a southern anchor and a secure base, far removed from the anti-ship ballistic missiles and other systems the Chinese are building to perpetuate an anti-access area denial strategy, to keep the U.S. military forces and push them out of their near seas in the East and South China Sea. Mm-hmm. This is 1,500 miles south of the nearest bit of the South China Sea, Darwin, Australia. The operational bit that's important as well is that this could become a multilateral training and exercise platform. So you could imagine working with everyone from Korea, Japan, and India, major naval powers in South and Northeast Asia, to ASEAN countries. And they could conduct exercises far removed from these very near seas that could be too provocative to exercise in. And that's an important operational benefit that could send a signal to the Chinese, this is not a threat, but our diplomacy and our economic engagement is backed up ultimately by military insurance.
I think it is principally about China, and that's an important point to make, not just to warn the Chinese, but I think in the course of all this we forget that there's a very large country just north of Australia, and the Indonesians, being a big country, have a little bit of a big country complex. They think it's about them. So it's important that we let everyone in the region know it's about China.
Sense?
Well, it's right off the coast of Indonesia, and the Indonesians have a long, complicated history with Australia. They've had Australian troops just recently in East Timor, so they're sensitive to that. So I think sometimes when we try to mute who this is about exactly, we can create other concerns, because we're not willing to say it's about China, which it is. Other people start wondering whether it's about them.
Okay, good point.
I'd just add that the Indonesians have played a very important hand in South China Sea diplomacy to try to calm the waters, to try to adjudicate some of the disputes. They do have this historic animus conflict, if you will, set of tensions with Australia that have really dissipated in the last few years, which has been a wonderful turn of events in terms of growing Indonesian-Australian cooperation. When I was with General Prabowo, the chairman of their joint forces, recently, there's no doubt that he shares the same Australian and American concern that many countries in this region feel, which is that maritime security is a common good. It's the so-called maritime commons on which we all depend for trade. The Malacca Strait is it's where geopolitics and globalization collide. we depend in our global economy on an open trading system. So we need maritime cooperation. The Indonesians understand that. I think it's important, therefore, to invite the Indonesians to be part of joint exercises with the Australians, with the Americans and others, and that will assuage any concerns that might come about from not identifying what the main purpose is here.
And do you think that will be forthcoming?
Oh, I think it will. It's just a matter of time.
Now back to China, because of course they're quite upset about this this presence that President Obama announced, the whole trip, in fact. So what is China doing, Walter Lohman, in the South China Sea that has so many in the region upset? Talk about that.
Well, over the last 2 years especially, you could go back a little longer, 3 or 4 years, they have been loudly asserting their rights, sovereign rights in the South China Sea. They have a couple different ways of packaging it. One is sort of in legal terms, another is in historical terms, in which they claim a vast area, 800,000 square miles of ocean, as their own. A couple of years ago, they made those claims clear to high-level officials, including the Secretary of State of the United States. And then since, especially this year, there have been quite a few, 10 or more incidents, especially with the Filipinos, over rights in those waters. Some of the incidents are occurring just 50 miles off the shore of Palawan Island in the Philippines, 70 miles offshore, and a good 600-700 miles away from China. They've had the same sort of problems with the Vietnamese, although much closer. A little bit less absurd, but still not a claim that doesn't quite hold water in a common sense sort of way.
How do you interpret what China is doing in the South China Sea that is riling so many of its neighbors? And do they have, justification for being nervous?
Well, they do. I mean, China militarized some of the disputes in the South China Sea back in the late 1980s and early 1990s. This recent bout of assertiveness on the part of the Chinese is mostly being undertaken by their civilian law enforcement fleet, and also in issuing orders for their fishing fleets to go out and strike historical claims and jurisdictional maritime claims. This goes back to what Walter was saying about this vast historical rights claim that China has. This is this famous 9-dash line, or U-shaped line, or sometimes called the cow's tongue. And it covers basically 90% of the South China Sea. The Chinese say, based on history, this is an internal body of water. This has nothing to do with outside powers. Well, it has everything to do with outside powers because, again, the Strait of Malacca is this major sea line of communication for the entire globe. And there's no legal justification based on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea to make that claim. That's why some Chinese who are careful about this say to their Chinese officials, they're going to have to look at the land features. And I say land features because not most of these are not islands. They're really little reefs or even underwater features. These little bits of land, under international law, if they're your sovereign bit of land, you only have a 12 nautical mile territorial water claim. So that hardly gives you the expanse of the entire South China Sea to China. So when the Philippines and Vietnam and other countries who are claimants see these claims, they can't stand up to China, and they're very concerned about this. And the Chinese have fought Vietnam over the Paracel Islands, which is one big island group, and they have skirmished with the Philippines over the years, famously in the 90s over Mischief Reef, but more recently again with the Philippines and the Spratly Islands, another big island group.
All right. Back to you, Walter Lohman. Characterize, if you will, the Chinese reaction. Were they surprised? Are they taken aback by the U.S. assertiveness in the region? Did the United States send the right message in your view? How do you see that?
Well, the last time this came up was last year, July, when the Secretary of State raised it in Hanoi. Their reaction this time is much more measured, seemingly less shocked by it. So, because it was telegraphed for some time that this was going to come up in the meetings, I have found their official reactions pretty calm, to tell you the truth. I don't think they have reacted much. Some of the newspapers have reacted pretty harshly, but and those newspapers are to some extent a reflection of party or government line. But I haven't found they have responded that that vociferously, but I think the reason why is because they're betting on the future. They're betting on time. I mean, they would be making a pretty good bet to assume that the President of the United States wouldn't be able to continue this kind of engagement over the long term. I think they're wrong about that. I mean, I only say it's a good bet because looking at the signals and all the obligations that he has around the world, it's hard to imagine. But I think they're reading that wrong. I think this president is committed to the region. I think this is a part of a long-term change that began years ago. Began 2 years and at least a year into this administration after some initial wrong steps, and I think it would be continued by a Republican administration.
Patrick Cronin, there's no question that the United States and China are in a sort of a competition. But on the other hand, China, we rely on China for so many things. For every product I think we purchase is somehow made in China, the debt and so forth. So we don't have a lot of leverage. But do you think the United States is sufficiently reasserting itself? Is it sending a certain signal to the Chinese? No, just a minute here. We're here, and are they in any way somehow taken aback, or does this inject any kind of fear that, they better watch, maybe make some changes, regarding, removing some, competition, distorting preferences, allowing their currency to appreciate? These are sticking points between the United States and China.
China's a complicated place and difficult to generalize, but not having a strong hand and just accommodating China is not something that's going to get you very far in negotiations with China. The United States is not unique in being a major trading partner with China. Every country in the region is a major trading partner with China. So we are interdependent, but interdependence economically is not sufficient to guarantee stability and security, which is why you need to think of this comprehensively. The Chinese have responded to some of the atmospherics of the summit, but as Walter suggests, not with histrionics, but more some sharp criticisms. For instance, saying President Obama was like a school prefect, warning the children of the region, lecturing the region, which he was not doing. He was there doing what the region had asked him to do, which is stand up to China, please provide a counterweight. So I think it's important for the United States to back up their economy and their political engagement with a strong military presence and to let the Chinese know that's going to be an enduring fact. Now let's figure out how we can cooperate. And I think that's what the president's trying to do. This is not a static picture. It is an ever-changing rhythm that will have to be followed throughout time. And the Chinese will accommodate when they start to see the region balancing against China, when China has overplayed its hand. And then when people dissipate and fragment, they'll play a strong hand again.
I think you can keep these two relationships in two different baskets. That is the economic relationship with the Chinese and the security political relationship with the Chinese. The fact that the Chinese are dependent on Australian iron ore and Australian coal, whose advantage is that? Is that the Australians' advantage or is that the Chinese advantage? They buy a lot of American bonds.
Exactly.
Who has more interest in their value, us or them? I mean, we're at the very least, we're interdependent. And on the economic side, the Chinese are very much open to discussion. They don't always do what we ask, but there's a lot of give and take. There's a lot of debate on their side about what the economy needs. There's a lot more room to work with them on. On the political security side, it's entirely different dynamics internally, entirely different dynamic within the region.
Before we close, I want to turn to the results of the ASEAN summit that took place in Bali, Indonesia, and particularly with respect to Burma, once a pariah country, now seemingly, making some very important progress on the political front. Even opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi is encouraging the United States to re-engage. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton will be going to Burma in the coming weeks. Walter Lohman, how do you see this turn of events with respect to Burma? Is it for real? Your assessment?
Well, I mean, there are things that have taken place. I mean, the cancellation of the dam project, the loosening up of labor laws, releasing Aung San Suu Kyi and allowing her to participate in the by-elections coming up, all those things are real. I mean, you can't dispute that they're real. The question is really what's driving it and whether there's a longer-term picture here, or whether these are all tactical moves in another game that really the military government, which it is still to some extent, is playing.
Well, which way do you see it?
Well, I think the president was wise to talk to Aung San Suu Kyi about it. You know, she's the one that knows best what's going on. She's in touch with both the generals and with her own people, and he asked her what she thought, and she thought he should engage. And according to press reports, she blessed his sending Hillary Clinton there to explore this further. And I think as long as he stays, you know, it's a chance he's taken. Okay, he's taken a chance here that he's entertaining something that's ultimately not constructive. But as long as he's lockstep with Aung San Suu Kyi, you know, it's very hard to find fault with it.
Any significant outcomes from your point of view from the ASEAN summit?
The ASEAN summit itself, I mean, you know, the announcement of Burma's chair in 2014 was probably the biggest news that they made, and really the first concession. You know, again, I'm deferring to Aung San Suu Kyi's expertise on this, but I got to say it was striking that the regime, having anticipated a release of political prisoners, as soon as that announcement was made, changed their mind, and they still haven't made that second tranche of release of political prisoners. And that's the kind of dance that we're involved in right now.
And Patrick Cronin, the last word to you on the significance of the upcoming visit of Hillary Clinton to Burma, the significance of the apparent, you know, change, evolution in Burma's political system. You know, do you think it's trying to, as Walter suggested, maybe con Western leaders into easing sanctions without actually fundamentally, you know, changing the country's political system? Or do you see, you know, other motivations at stake? And what about the outcome of the ASEAN summit? Anything significant besides, of course, Burma's election to be chair in 2014?
This is the most serious chance for reform in Burma we've seen in decades. And Aung San Suu Kyi has consistently told that to senior visitors. And when Secretary Clinton meets with Aung San Suu Kyi, this will be the greatest show of soft power that we've seen in recent years. Imagine this, a military junta, all the power controlling this country, and you've got China as your main benefactor outside. And these two women, when they get together, just the moral power they will have on the internet and through photographs and through the media will send a message far beyond Myanmar, far beyond Burma, but to the region. And I think that's a very good thing to do. The United States is not going to lift sanctions soon. We're going to take step-by-step, action-for-action steps. And we're going to, meanwhile, mobilize and work with all those friendly countries that who are already working in the country. Japan, other members of Southeast Asia's ASEAN, India, Korea. They're all working already in Myanmar. The government is overloaded. It can hardly take even the delegation. The press delegation alone will overwhelm Myanmar. How will Myanmar or Burma get ready for hosting all the ASEAN meetings in 2014? This is a critical decision. Walter's right. For the ASEAN members to say, we want Burma to be in the chair for all of these important multilateral meetings that will occur in 2014, including the East Asia Summit in 2014, when the American president will be expected to show up, just as President Obama showed up in Bali. That'll be a huge step. And the question is, will these reforms continue through 2014, or are there real limits? And here's the limit. The limit is right now nobody thinks that the military regime wants to give up power for democracy. But there is real reform going on. So that's the balance right now, and we're hoping maybe things will change further.
Well, on that note, I'm afraid that's all the time we have on this edition of Encounter. I'd like to thank my guests, Walter Lohman, Director of the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation here in Washington, and Patrick Cronin, Senior Director of the Asia-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, also based in Washington. Gentlemen, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And sharing your great insights. Encounter was produced in Washington. Thanks to Anna Zalewski for booking our guests. Our engineers were Gary Jaffe, Ted Schneider, and Jackson Witt. And I'm Carol Castiel. Join me again next week for another Encounter on the Voice of America.